Operation Bolo, How America Trapped North Vietnam's MiG-21s, January 2, 1967. High above North Vietnam, radar operators watched formations of American aircraft approaching the Hanoi region. To them, the pattern looked familiar. The aircraft were coming along routes normally used by Republic F-105 Thunderchief fighter bombers. They were flying like F-105s. Their electronic emissions looked like F-105 formations. Even their behavior suggested another American bombing mission was approaching. For North Vietnam's MiG-21 pilots, this appeared to be exactly the kind of opportunity they had learned to exploit. The F-105 was fast and powerful, but when loaded with bombs, it was vulnerable. MiG-21 pilots had learned to approach American strike formations quickly, attack under favorable conditions, and disappear before American escort fighters could respond. But on this afternoon, there was one enormous problem. Those aircraft were not F-105 Thunderchiefs. They were F-4 Phantom fighters, and they were waitings for the MiGs. What followed became one of the most famous aerial deception operations of the Vietnam War. Its name was Operation Bolo. To understand why the United States created such an elaborate trap, we have to understand what was happening in the skies over North Vietnam during late 1966. The American air campaign known as Operation Rolling Thunder had already been underway since March 1965. American aircraft repeatedly struck targets across North Vietnam. One of the principal strike aircraft was the Republic F-105 Thunderchief, commonly called the Thud. The F-105 had originally been designed to deliver nuclear weapons at high speed and low altitude. In Vietnam, it became one of the primary aircraft used to attack bridges, rail lines, military facilities, and other heavily defended targets. But the aircraft flying toward those targets faced an increasingly dangerous air defense network. North Vietnam combined radar stations, anti-aircraft artillery, surface-to-air missiles, and fighter aircraft into an integrated defense system. The MiGs did not have to defeat every American aircraft. They only had to disrupt the bombing formations. That distinction was important. A MiG attacking a group of bomb-loaded F-105s could force the American pilots to jettison their bombs so they could maneuver defensively. Even if the MiG did not shoot down an aircraft, forcing an American strike fighter to abandon its bombs could still prevent the target from being attacked. North Vietnam's fighter force, therefore, did not need to engage American fighters in conventional battles every time they appeared. Its pilots could choose when to attack. They could wait for favorable situations. They could attack quickly. Then they could retreat toward friendly territory. This approach was especially effective because American pilots operated under strict rules of engagement. During this period, American commanders were generally not permitted to simply destroy North Vietnamese fighters while they sat on certain airfields. Instead, if the Americans wanted to eliminate the MiGs, they often had to fight them in the air. That created a frustrating problem. The North Vietnamese pilots understood that the American F-4 Phantom was dangerous, so they often avoided it. But they were much more interested in attacking bomb-carrying F-105 formations. By late 1966, the MiG-21 had become an increasingly serious threat. The Soviet-designed MiG-21 was small, fast, and difficult to see. It could exceed Mach 2 under the right conditions. It was also significantly smaller than the F-4 Phantom. North Vietnamese MiG-21 pilots normally operated under close direction from ground controllers. Radar stations could track American formations approaching North Vietnam. Controllers would then position the MiGs for short, high-speed attacks. Instead of remaining in a prolonged dogfight, a MiG-21 could approach from a favorable position, launch its missiles, and then break away. This was exactly the kind of fight North Vietnam wanted. The Americans needed to change the situation, and one of the men determined to change it was Colonel Robin Olds. Olds was not a typical Vietnam-era fighter commander. He had already been a fighter ace during World War II. Flying P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs against Germany, he had accumulated extensive combat experience before the jet age had fully arrived. By 1966, Olds was commanding the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base. His aircraft were F-4 Phantoms. The F-4 was one of the most powerful fighters in the world. It was large, extremely fast, and carried sophisticated radar and missiles. But American technological superiority did not automatically guarantee dominance in the skies over Vietnam. The F-4 had been designed during an era when many military planners believed guided missiles would largely replace close-range dogfighting. Early versions of the Air Force F-4 did not even have an internal cannon. American pilots relied primarily on AM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles and AM-9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles. Those weapons were impressive on paper. Vietnam revealed their limitations. Missiles could malfunction. Radar identification could be difficult. Rules of engagement often required pilots to visually identify targets before firing. By the time visual identification had been completed, aircraft were sometimes already too close for an ideal missile shot. The Americans had extremely sophisticated aircraft, but the conditions over Vietnam often pushed those aircraft into battles that designers had not completely anticipated. Olds believed one way to regain the initiative was not simply to build a better aircraft. It was to manipulate what the enemy believed was happening. Working closely with Captain John B. Stone and other officers of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, Olds developed an extraordinary deception plan. If North Vietnamese MiG-21 pilots refused to fight F-4s but eagerly attacked F-105s, then the Americans would make F-4s appear to be F-105s. The idea was simple. Executing it was not. North Vietnamese radar operators had become familiar with American bombing patterns. They knew the routes commonly followed by F-105 formations. They understood their altitudes, their speeds, their timing, their radio procedures, and increasingly they understood their electronic signatures. This created the foundation for Operation Bolo. The F-4s would imitate an F-105 strike package as closely as possible. They would fly the same routes. They would use similar formations. They would use familiar call signs and procedures. Most importantly, the F-4s would carry electronic countermeasure pods normally associated with the F-105. These devices were among the most important details of the deception. American strike aircraft were facing a serious threat from North Vietnamese SA-2 surface-to-air missiles. To interfere with enemy radar, F-105 formations began carrying QRC-160 electronic jamming pods, later associated with the ALQ-71 designation. When several properly spaced aircraft used these pods together, their jamming could significantly complicate North Vietnamese radar tracking. But the electronic signal created another unintended effect. North Vietnamese radar operators could learn to associate that electronic signature with incoming F-105 formations. Olds and his planners recognized an opportunity. If F-4s carried the same pods and followed the same flight profile, North Vietnamese controllers might believe another group of Thunderchiefs was approaching. The Phantoms would effectively disguise themselves electronically. This was not camouflage in the visual sense. From close range, nobody would confuse an F-4 Phantom with an F-105 Thunderchief. The deception was aimed at the people watching radar screens and directing the MiGs before the aircraft could see one another. Operation Bolo was therefore a battle of information before it became a battle of aircraft. The plan went even further. F-4s from the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing would approach from the west along routes associated with F-105 strikes. Other F-4s from the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing were intended to approach from another direction and complicate the MiG's ability to escape. The goal was to make North Vietnam believe vulnerable bombers were entering its airspace. Then, once the MiG-21s were airborne, the Americans would close the exits. The operation was initially planned for January 1, 1967. Weather forced a delay. On January 2nd, the mission went forward. Weather remained poor. Clouds covered large areas around the North Vietnamese airfields. This was dangerous for both sides. It also created uncertainty. The Americans could not know exactly when the MiGs would appear. North Vietnamese pilots coming through the clouds would have limited time to understand what was waiting above them. Colonel Robin Olds personally led the first formation. The American flights used names associated with automobile manufacturers. Olds Flight, Ford Flight, Rambler Flight. The aircraft crossed into North Vietnam. Everything was designed to look like another bombing mission. At first, nothing happened. The sky remained quiet. Minutes passed. This was dangerous. The F-4s could not remain over enemy territory indefinitely. Fuel was limited. Surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns were still threats. And if the MiGs never appeared, the entire deception might fail. Then the trap began to close. MiG-21 started emerging to intercept the formations they believed were F-105 Thunderchiefs. But instead of bomb-laden strike aircraft, the North Vietnamese pilots found missile-armed F-4 Phantoms prepared specifically for air-to-air combat. The situation had been reversed. Normally, the MiGs decided when and how the engagement would begin. Now the Americans had created the engagement themselves. The first encounters developed rapidly. MiGs appeared through openings in the cloud layer. F-4 crews maneuvered aggressively to acquire them. Olds himself engaged one of the MiG-21s. During the battle, he launched missiles at the enemy fighter and received credit for destroying it. Other Phantom crews were attacking simultaneously. The sky became a chaotic combination of aircraft, clouds, radar calls, and missiles. The MiG-21 was not helpless. Far from it. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it was a dangerous opponent. Its small size made it difficult to see. It had excellent acceleration and could quickly enter or leave an engagement. But Operation Bolo had removed one of its greatest advantages. Surprise. The North Vietnamese pilots had been prepared to attack Thunderchiefs. Instead, they entered combat against Phantoms already positioned and prepared to fight them. The battle lasted only minutes. According to official U.S. Air Force records, 7 MiG-21s were credited as destroyed. No American F-4s were lost in the engagement. American accounts describe the 7 destroyed MiGs as roughly half of North Vietnam's operational MiG-21 force at the time. Vietnamese accounts and later historical reconstructions have sometimes reported a smaller number of confirmed MiG-21 losses from the battle. That difference is worth remembering. Air combat claims during wartime are not always identical between opposing sides. Pilots may see an aircraft damaged and disappearing into clouds without knowing whether it crashes. Multiple crews may attack the same aircraft. Records created during combat may later conflict with surviving enemy documents. But regardless of whether the final loss total is counted as 5 or 7 aircraft, the operational effect of Bolo was significant. North Vietnam had been forced into exactly the kind of battle it normally tried to avoid, and the United States had done it primarily through deception. Just 4 days later, the Americans conducted another deceptive operation. This time, F-4s imitated the behavior of reconnaissance aircraft. 2 more MiG-21s were credited as destroyed. MiG activity then declined sharply for a period, while North Vietnamese commanders reassessed their tactics. Some U.S. Air Force accounts describe several months of greatly reduced MiG-21 operations. At first glance, Operation Bolo appears to be a simple American victory. But its deeper lessons are more complicated. The first lesson was that technology alone did not determine air superiority. The United States possessed enormously sophisticated aircraft. Yet before Bolo, North Vietnam had still found ways to use a much smaller fighter force effectively. The MiG-21s were successful because they operated as part of an entire defensive system. Radar stations detected American formations. Ground controllers directed the fighters. Surface-to-air missiles restricted American movement. Anti-aircraft artillery added another layer of danger. The MiGs attacked when conditions favored them. The Americans therefore had to attack the system's decision-making process. Operation Bolo did exactly that. Olds did not simply ask how an F-4 could defeat a MiG-21. He asked a different question. What information causes North Vietnam to launch its MiG-21s? Once American planners understood that question, they could manipulate the answer. They copied the routes. They copied the formations. They copied the electronic signature. They copied the behavior the enemy expected. Then they replaced the vulnerable aircraft with fighters. In modern military language, this was not merely air combat. It was information warfare. The second lesson involved predictability. During Rolling Thunder, American bombing missions often followed patterns. Those patterns helped North Vietnam prepare ambushes. An opponent does not necessarily need superior technology if it can accurately predict what the other side will do. Operation Bolo temporarily turned that predictability against North Vietnam. The Americans deliberately followed a familiar pattern because they wanted the enemy to recognize it. This time, predictability became the weapon. The third lesson was about leadership. Robin Olds was not operating from a distant headquarters. He personally flew the mission. That mattered to the pilots under his command. Olds had inherited a wing that needed renewed confidence and tactical focus. He emphasized aggressive training and combat leadership. The success of Bolo strengthened the reputation of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing. The unit would become widely known as the Wolf Pack. But Bolo did not end the air war. This is one of the most important parts of the story. North Vietnam adapted. Replacement aircraft arrived. Pilots changed tactics. Ground controllers learned from what had happened. Later in the war, MiG-21s would again become dangerous opponents. American fighter forces would also continue discovering weaknesses in their own training and doctrine. The Vietnam War ultimately pushed both the U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy to reconsider how fighter pilots were trained for air-to-air combat. Realistic combat training became increasingly important. The Navy established its famous fighter weapons school, better known as Top Gun, in 1969. The Air Force later developed major training programs such as Red Flag. Operation Bolo was part of this larger evolution. It demonstrated that successful air combat required much more than superior speed, radar, or missiles. Pilots needed realistic training. Commanders needed intelligence. Planners needed to understand enemy behavior. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon was convincing the enemy that he already understood what was happening. There is another reason Operation Bolo remains fascinating. It reversed the psychological structure of the fight. Before January 2nd, North Vietnamese pilots frequently decided whether to accept combat. They attacked F-105s when conditions were favorable and avoided F-4s when possible. Bolo removed that choice. For a brief period, the hunters became the hunted. North Vietnamese controllers saw what appeared to be another familiar American strike. MiG pilots took off expecting an opportunity. By the time they realized what had happened, they were already inside the trap. Yet Bolo also reveals one of the central realities of the Vietnam Air War. No tactical victory permanently solved the larger problem. American forces could dominate one battle and still face a capable enemy weeks or months later. North Vietnam absorbed losses, changed procedures, and continued fighting. The Americans adapted. Then the North Vietnamese adapted again. It became a continuous contest between technology, intelligence, training, and tactics. That is why Operation Bolo deserves to be remembered as more than a dramatic dogfight. The missiles and aircraft were only the final stage. The battle had effectively begun before the first Phantom crossed into North Vietnamese airspace. It began when American planners studied their opponent and realized that North Vietnam's greatest tactical strength could also become a vulnerability. The MiG-21 pilots had become extremely selective. They attacked when they believed they had an advantage. Robin Olds gave them exactly what they wanted to see: a formation of vulnerable F-105 Thunderchiefs. Except the Thunderchiefs were not there. Hidden behind the familiar routes, formations, and electronic signals were F-4 Phantoms prepared for combat. On January 2nd, 1967, North Vietnam launched its fighters believing it had found another opportunity. Instead, it entered one of the most carefully constructed aerial traps of the Vietnam War. And in only a few minutes, Operation Bolo became a lasting lesson in deception, intelligence, and air warfare. Because sometimes victory does not begin when you fire the first missile. Sometimes it begins when you convince your enemy to make exactly the decision you wanted him to make.